Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are stepping right back into 19th century America. And let me tell you, at that time, it was essentially an archaeological Wild West. Picture this. You've got these vast earthworks and massive ancient mounds just dotting the American landscape, and they were completely baffling the European settlers who stumbled across them. Now, instead of attributing these magnificent structures to the ancestors of the Native Americans who were standing right in front of them, this massive frenzy of speculation ignited. History was entirely up for grabs, and some individuals were more than willing to just manufacture the truth. So, who actually settled this ancient American frontier? And maybe more importantly, who forged the evidence to try and steal their story? It's a central mystery that really turns this explainer into a high-stakes detective story. We are going to look at the attempt to overwrite Native American history through a series of elaborate, sometimes unbelievably clumsy, but deeply impactful archaeological forgeries. It's a crazy tale of ambition, religion, and the incredible modern science that finally laid these fabrications to rest for good. Okay, let's dive into this, because to understand the crime, you really have to understand the motive. Back in the mid-19th century, religious and political debates were absolutely reaching a boiling point. The quote you see here from an 1857 church review highlights a massive anxiety of that era. You had many scholars and religious leaders who desperately wanted to prove that the newly discovered Native Americans were actually the lost tribes of Israel. And that leads us directly to this doctrine called monogenesis. It's basically the 19th century assertion that all humans descended from a single biblical origin. Now, historically speaking, trying to prove monogenesis was actually a major motive for folks who were trying to combat scientific racism and the justifications for slavery, which, often relied on the idea that different races had totally different origins. But here is the profound irony of it all. In their zeal to prove that all humans shared one biblical lineage, these 19th century thinkers ended up actively erasing actual authentic indigenous history, and they replaced it with a European biblical narrative. Section 1. The suspect lineup and their fake evidence. Just take a look at the stone here. Notice the suspiciously neat, quote-unquote, ancient block Hebrew inscribed all over it. This is the Newark Decalogue stone, famously discovered by a surveyor named David Warwick out in Ohio back in 1860. Now, Warwick was a fanatical believer that ancient Israelites built the American mounds. And incredibly, or, suspiciously, just when he needed proof the absolute most, he literally dug it right out of the ground. What are the odds, right? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is our second artifact. This is the Bat Creek Stone. It was dug up in Tennessee in 1889 by John Emmert, who was this sort of isolated field assistant working for the Smithsonian Institution. Emmert claimed he found this Paleo-Hebrew inscription tucked under a skull in an undisturbed mound. And for decades, literally decades, it was championed by some folks as the ultimate, undeniable proof of Judean sailors crossing the Atlantic in ancient times. But when we take a step back and break down the actual personal motivations behind these frontier frauds, well, a much less romantic picture emerges. Let's take John Emmert. The guy had a history of drinking and had actually been fired before. So he likely forged the Bat Creek Stone simply to impress his boss and secure a permanent job at the Smithsonian. Others, like the guys behind the Grave Creek Stone, they just wanted to make a quick buck off gullible tourists. And overarching this whole shebang was that intense desire to validate the Bible and prove monogenesis. Ultimately, these objects were literally manufactured to save a history that absolutely did not need saving. Section 2. Exposing the fraud the paleography experts ride in. All right, prepare yourselves, because this right here is the absolute smoking gun of our explainer. Check out this side-by-side comparison. On the left, we've got the Bat Creek Stone. On the right, that's an illustration from a widely available 1870 Masonic dictionary. Keep in mind, that book was published 19 years before the stone was magically discovered. The crude letters on the Bat Creek Stone, yeah, they aren't ancient Hebrew at all. They perfectly, clumsily match the exact illustration from that modern reference book. It's just an incredible visual irony. Think about it. The grand, sweeping myth of ancient Judean sailors bravely navigating the stormy Atlantic just to settle in Tennessee. It's completely shattered by the mundane fact that a disgruntled 19th century field worker simply traced a Masonic textbook to keep his paycheck coming. This incredibly desperate attempt for job security birthed a hoax that actually managed to fool people for over a century. And, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was practically a widespread frontier crime wave. You had the Grave Creek Stone, the Michigan relics. Fakers were constantly tweaking their methods to try and trick mainstream science.
It was like a game of whack-a-mole. As experts debunked one, another fraudster would learn from those mistakes and try to create a slightly better piece of fool's gold. But thankfully, none of them held up to true, rigorous scientific scrutiny. Section 3, the final showdown, modern genomics.
So let's forget that fake 19th century lost tribes timeline for a minute. What you see here is the actual, verified, scientific timeline of pre-Columbian settlement. Modern genomic evidence unequivocally shows that the ancestors of all present-day Native Americans entered the Americas from Siberia, and this happened no earlier than 23,000 years ago. They ended their isolation in Beringia around 15,000 years ago, and then genetically split into northern and southern branches around 13,000 years ago.
So, the crucial point is 23,000 years. To put that into perspective, when you look at the sheer massive scale of 23,000 years of established indigenous presence in the Americas, those 19th century biblical timelines, the ones that tried to squeeze the whole mound builder civilization into just a few thousand years of Middle Eastern history, they look incredibly recent, impossibly cramped, and frankly, entirely fabricated. Just look at the migration route mapped out here. I mean, this is basically the nail in the coffin for those frontier forgers. Modern high-coverage genome sequencing maps prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a single migration wave across Beringia. The ancestors of all Native Americans migrated from Siberia. Not the Levant, not Europe, and certainly not from some lost fleet of Judean ships. And the scientific literature states this incredibly clearly. Genomic sequencing provides absolutely zero support for any early Mediterranean or European migration. The DNA leaves literally no room for the Hebrew Israelite myth or any of those other European diffusionist fantasies that those forged, traced stones were trying so desperately to support. And this brilliantly illustrates the mathematical reality of the situation. This principal component analysis chart maps out modern and ancient global genomes. Just look at how the Native American genomes firmly and distinctly cluster together with East Asian and Siberian origins. They are mathematically and completely distinct from Middle Eastern and European populations. The data simply does not lie. So, what is our final verdict on the frontier? Well, these so-called holy stones were nothing more than 19th century colonial inventions. The Back Creek stone was literally traced out of an 1870 Masonic dictionary by an employee who was just trying to save his job. And most importantly, DNA unequivocally proved a Siberian migration that happened over 23,000 years ago. The whole myth of the lost tribes was just a coordinated attempt to overwrite a vibrant indigenous heritage, a heritage that is rich, complete, and entirely authentic all on its own. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought to ponder. We've seen the evidence, we've caught the forgers red-handed, and we've looked at the undeniable DNA. Yet somehow, these myths still occasionally pop up today. Why is society so quick to embrace a convoluted hoax, like a fake rock trace from a literal dictionary, over the incredible, established resilience and the 23,000-year history of indigenous peoples? It's a deep question about human nature and the stories we choose to tell ourselves. Think about that the next time you hear a historical claim that sounds just a little too perfectly aligned with someone's personal agenda. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the right questions.